What are you doing? Seriously? Honestly? Man.
Anyways, on November 18th of 1978, nearly 1,000 people passed away in a murder-suicide under the instruction of Jim Jones, a cult leader who amassed a large following in a location dubbed Jonestown. But first, let's back up a bit to understand how this disturbing and horrific tragedy came to be. Jim Jones spawned in on May 13, 1931. His father was a World War I veteran who lived on disability payments whilst dealing with severe breathing problems caused by gas attacks he'd experienced during the war. So he sometimes found himself in hospitals getting treatment. Jones's mother was not around much, often straight up neglecting him. Jim Jones's childhood wasn't exactly ideal, though I guess most cult leaders don't really grow up in perfect families. One of his neighbors, Myrtle Kennedy, wow, what a name, spent some time with Jones while he was young and taught him a bit about religion, which might have had an effect on his eventual passion for it. As the years went on, his opinions and views at the time were not exactly common. Jones in his high school years began to study the ideals and beliefs of Hitler, Stalin, Marx, and much more. This went on to form his strong interest in both communism and socialism. Jones even joined the Communist Party of the USA in his local area. These ideals would show up in how he'd go on to run his cult in the near future. Soon after graduating from high school, Jones went on to university, initially hoping to become a doctor. A year later, he got married to another student, Marceline Baldwin, who was pursuing a degree in nursing. As Jones got more and more invested in the Communist Party of the USA, he'd start to get investigated by the FBI. As a reminder, this was the early 1950s, where the Cold War had just begun, and things like the Red Scare and McCarthyism were massive at the time. Jim Jones, now in his early 20s, found himself working in small churches in the area he lived in, specifically rural Indiana. He tried to find a specific church or even just a religion in general which fit his uncommon beliefs at the time, but he couldn't. So he came up with a plan. With the intention of spreading his communist ideologies, Jones became a Christian minister of sorts. Quote, "How can I demonstrate my Marxism?" The thought was, infiltrate the church. This led to Jones finding himself eventually wanting to become his own leader, running his own church. In 1953, after attending a church meeting in his area, Jones met a woman who told him that he was a Messiah, carrying and spreading the messages of God. This idea stuck with him as he continued to work for the church, and in 1955, he opened the very first People's Temple Church, named after the official name of Jones's soon-to-be cult, the People's Temple. The man was an objectively charismatic leader, allowing him to easily gain followers who believed in him and his teachings. Jones made his church open to everyone of all races, which at a time when segregation was still common, made the People's Temple even more of an attractive option to a wider range of individuals otherwise rejected by churches in the area. He was heavily criticized for these beliefs in his area, leading to fights and sometimes even assassination attempts on him. Anyways, Jones also preached his political ideologies of Marxism and socialism, as well as other spiritual things, like how he called himself the reincarnation of Elijah the prophet, sent to spread the word of God. With Jim Jones consistently talking about racial integration in both his church and his community in Indiana, these ideals actually began to spread, and in the early 1960s, Indianapolis, the area in which he lived, was far less segregated, leading to some claiming that Jim Jones was almost entirely responsible for this shift. Even in his personal life, Jones and his wife adopted many children, all all from different backgrounds with different ethnicities, 3 of which were part Korean, and the Korean War was just a few years prior, so Jones even convinced members of the People's Temple to go out and adopt or just help anyone needing it who came from Korea at the time. He called both his family and the People's Temple the Rainbow Family at times. Living during a period of constant wars influenced Jim Jones in a negative way. He was extremely paranoid of a vast nuclear fallout basically destroying the entire world and civilization as we know it. So he came up with the idea of completely relocating him and his family to a place that was much less of a target if nuclear war broke out: Brazil. In 1961, Jones and his family headed all the way to Brazil, though they ended up making a stop or two along the way, one of which was in Jonestown, Guyana. At the time, Guyana was just a small British-owned colony in South America, meaning most spoke English in the area. Though only a couple years later, in 1963, Jones had to move back to the United States after failing to appear in civil rights, church, and other community-related meetings that he became a relatively prominent member in. Not only this, but members of the People's Temple, his own organization, started to dwindle with, well, no sight of their leader that they had all believed in. So Jones briefly visited Indiana to check up on the church, and well, just like your mom, it wasn't looking good. He returned to financial ruin, and basically nobody showed up anymore. Jones couldn't just let everything he had worked on for years crumble, so he sold the original People's Temple building in an effort to scrounge up enough money to relocate. He temporarily moved to another smaller building nearby to interact with his followers and grow back the numbers he once had. In just a few months, Jones preached that there would soon be a nuclear war devastating Indiana and that side of the states that the group resided in. He claimed that it would all happen on July 15th of 1967. So, worried about their own safety, the People's Temple moved across the country to California, though not everybody. Some of his assistants or other higher-ups in the People's Temple were not pleased with how things were going. They were reluctant to believe everything Jones said about the incoming nuclear war. As time went on, these people were heavy believers in Christianity and not so much into the whole shebang that Jones was preaching about. So most of these leaders in the People's Temple decided to stay behind in Indiana, while one decided to move with Jones and the other followers. In the next few years, Jones and the rest of the People's Temple continued growing the organization all across California. From Los Angeles to San Francisco, the group was expanding at a steady rate, though the truth behind how he treated the group and his followers started to emerge. Jones reportedly blackmailed, assaulted, and beat any who openly disagreed with him. He also was a heavy drinker who often used drugs, which further increased his paranoia of nuclear war and other things he found himself worried about. All of these allegations coming to light probably didn't affect much of Jones's life at first, considering it was during a time before social media, so news of this most likely predominantly spread through word of mouth, newspapers, and maybe even TV. Nonetheless, the People's Temple continued to grow, reaching thousands of followers, though there was something that just bothered Jones. What if the media outlets that covered the abuse allegations never gave up? What if the police would soon come knocking on the People's Temple door with plenty of evidence of all of the wrongdoings Jones had been doing over the years? So as a backup plan in case everything went wrong, Jones and others came up with the idea of establishing a base in Guyana, specifically near where Jones visited all those years ago. It was an attractive option to the group considering many locals spoke English, it shared socialist practices, and fewer members in the People's Temple would experience racism in Guyana. It's alleged that Jones wanted to originally make the base in Russia or China, since both held up communist ideologies that he very much liked, though in the end it was deemed impossible. After many negotiations with the Guyanese government, Jones and his people secured a plot of land deep in the jungle of Guyana, and soon after, a few dozen members of the People's Temple were sent to begin building what would go on to be known as Jonestown. Jonestown was a paradise in the mind of Jones, with the constant threat of media persecution possibly looming in the background back in San Francisco. When asked about Jonestown, Jones's wife said it was a place, quote, dedicated to live for socialism, total economic, racial, and social equality. We are living here communally. Jones himself stated, quote, I believe we're the purest communists there are. Jones continued to butter up his relationship with the Guyanese government, hoping to ensure safe passage for hundreds and maybe even thousands of members of the People's Temple come the day he perceived necessary to move. Even Guyana's prime minister at the time, Forbes Burnham, had only good things to say about the group. Nobody could predict the true horror that would follow in the next few years. Between 1974 and 1977, members of the People's Temple arriving at Jonestown expecting a grand paradise were horribly disappointed. The living conditions were brutal. They had to completely build houses, clear out fields of jungle shrubbery, and grow their own food. Not to mention, it was constantly humid and extremely hot, just like your mom. Going from ordering McDonald's to living like it's the 1800s, it was all probably not as appealing as Jones had described this so-called paradise to be. It was at its worst during the first few months of Jonestown's existence. Temple members were forced to work 6 days a week from roughly 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., with only an hour of break throughout the entire day. Not to mention the time spent afterwards being in mandatory classes about socialism. Jones also often preached good things about Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and even Kim Il-sung of North Korea. But that's not all. Jones basically controlled the lives of the members of the People's Temple who lived in Jonestown. He had complete control over who an individual could marry or even just interact with. Oh, you like this person? You gotta marry Cornelius Cartwell Crinklebottom right over there. It was a complete dictatorship, and members of the group had started to regret ever coming to Jonestown, and even getting involved with a man like Jim Jones. You're probably thinking, well, if they didn't like it anymore, why didn't they just leave? They literally couldn't. Jones instructed other members who were in high positions within the temple to shoot anyone fleeing or leaving the temple. And if they heard of someone planning to escape, they'd poison the food or drink of the person attempting to leave. Yeah. There was only one way that members could leave. However, it required crystal clear permission from Jones, which wasn't exactly given out often. At this point in time, back in San Francisco, the People's Temple was still just a religious organization that preached equality, peace, and other similar ideals. Political figures began to notice Jim Jones and some of his viewpoints that were polarizing at the time. The People's Temple actually had many volunteers support George Moscone, a candidate for mayor in San Francisco during the 1975 race. Moscone was a progressive figure in the San Francisco political space, sharing many of the same views that Jones had. Relations between Jim Jones and George Moscone continued to grow, especially after Moscone ended up winning the race, becoming mayor. Thankful for everything Jones and the group did, in the next year, Mayor Moscone appointed Jones as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority, which basically oversees the management of public housing in the area. With this position and ever-growing political networking, Jones met a ton of high-profile individuals, one of which being Rosalind Carter, former First Lady and wife of the 39th President, Jimmy Carter. This seemed to be the highest point of Jim Jones's career and maybe even life. He was building powerful connections across both the United States and Guyana, though unbeknownst to him, all of this would soon come crashing down. On one calm summer day in 1977, Jim Jones met with an editor in a magazine company about an upcoming story being written about him, describing a multitude of allegations of abuse from former People's Temple members. It's not like this was the first time allegations had been made, though Jones had been feeling a sense of ever-growing pressure building on him, as if he only had so much time left before he'd be caught. So he decided that night he would evacuate to Jonestown, bringing along hundreds of his followers with him. Now with around 900 temple members all located within Jonestown, Jones cranked up the intensity within the cult by performing things he called White Nights, in which the loyalty of members was severely tested. It consisted of Jones telling members of the People's Temple to drink a mysterious liquid. Okay, no, it's not what you're thinking. The drink, he claimed, was laced with cyanide. Now, in general, during this time, most of the drinks weren't actually dosed with poison. It was just a test to see if people would follow his twisted orders at the time. This went on for weeks, and of course, not everyone wanted to drink the stuff being forced on them. Unfortunately, those who refused were beaten or legitimately poisoned. White Nights weren't just about these drinks, however, as sometimes it would consist of Jones rambling on about the government, perceived enemies of the People's Temple, and more things that seemed to show his further dive into madness. There wasn't really a way out of Jones's cult at this point. If you were in, you had to be in. During the wake of ongoing allegations of abuse and awful things detailed about Jim Jones, back in the US, where he had just left, a congressman and representative from California, Leo Ryan, wanted to investigate and talk to Jones wherever he was. Ryan had a somewhat personal interest in the life of Jones and the obvious cult he created and surrounded himself with. Some of Ryan's friends and relatives knew people who went missing connected to the cult, so using his position and power, he decided to do some good old investigating. Ryan had contacted Jones and eventually was granted permission to visit Jonestown and conduct interviews. So that's what he did. It was now November 14th, 1978. Gathering a small crew of reporters, government officials, and just concerned relatives, totaling only around 15 people, Ryan and the group soon set off towards Guyana. When they arrived to Jonestown, things just seemed off. Everyone was acting all happy and excited. Ugh, gross.
Howdy. So we are at least friends in that extent. I'm very glad to be here. This is a congressional inquiry. I think that all of you know that I'm here to find out more about questions that have been raised about your operation here. But I can tell you right now that from the few conversations I've had with some of the folks here already this evening, that whatever the comments are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened in their whole life.
Two members of the cult were planning on sneaking away later that night. One of them even snuck a message to the visitors, though it was reported that some douchebag, some scoundrel, saw the letter being delivered and snitched. Okay, well, it was a little kid that snitched, but still, The visitors knew something was wrong, and the whole shtick of everyone being happy was just that, a shtick. Good news though, the two who gave the message ended up surviving and made it out of the cult. They weren't even the only two to make it out. Early in the morning of November 18th, 11 cult members, including Jones's head of security, escaped, feeling the sense that something bad was coming. Ryan's group was leaving later that day, so they had been processing and allowing anyone who wanted to escape the cults to go back with them to the United States. In Jones's mind, this wasn't how the visit was supposed to go. He'd been rehearsing what to say and telling the group how to act prior to Ryan's visit so that when the group arrived, they'd be convinced everything was fine. He didn't plan for temple members to be slipping notes to the visitors or even just blatantly stating that they wanted to leave. Now, Jones began to wonder what would happen if Ryan and the group returned to the United States knowing what they know. Around this time, one People's Temple member, Don Ujara Sly, lunged at Leo Ryan with a knife. Both fell to the ground and had a short scuffle before Ujara was quickly stopped by others and subsequently moved far away from Ryan. Luckily, Ryan wasn't injured or hurt at all, albeit a little shaken up. Ryan understood it was now time to go. Ujara obviously wasn't happy with Ryan and how the group was taking away other members of his family per se, so who knew if there were others who felt the same way and maybe even were willing to do worse. Ryan's group now also included the few defectors who wanted to leave and were seemingly allowed by Jones to leave. One member of the People's Temple, Larry Layton, demanded to leave with Ryan and the group. The thing is, Larry was known for being an extremely loyal addition to the cult, so something felt off about him suddenly wanting to leave. But in the end, they allowed him to come with. The entire group soon headed back to the airstrip, intending to finally return back to the United States. Now, with unexpected additional passengers, Ryan's group needed an extra plane to carry everybody back to the US. They had to wait some time, and at around 5 p.m., individuals began boarding as normal on both planes. They all had no clue of the kind of man that Jim Jones really was. Under the orders of Jim Jones, a tractor large enough to carry your mom with a small trailer attached to the back drove up on the runway about 30 feet across from one of the planes that was preparing to take off. It was then that 9 members of the cult's security squad hopped out of the back, armed with rifles, shotguns, and handguns. They then slowly approached, opening fire on the plane from basically all sides. Meanwhile, on the other plane, Larry Layton, the cult's loyalist that for some reason wanted to leave with Ryan's group, pulled out a handgun and started shooting. Everyone was already inside the plane as it was about to take off. Larry got a few shots off before the gun jammed, and someone was able to disarm him. Overall, Leo Ryan and several others in the group were killed, with everyone still alive now being injured. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones had soon received word of the events that unfolded at the airstrip. He now knew that his time had come. As soon as the US would hear of what had just happened, him and his entire cult would be hunted to the ends of the earth. So he called everyone in Jonestown together to do something he called revolutionary suicide. A large tub was filled and mixed with Flavor Aid, a bootleg Kool-Aid, and a wide variety of drugs, including cyanide. Jones instructed children to drink first, then the rest of the adults. In these final moments, Jones was recorded on a cassette tape preaching his mumbo-jumbo while you can hear babies crying and voices slowly fade in numbers as it goes on.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, A handful of our people, with their lies, have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Mother, please. Mother, please, don't do this. Lay down your life with your child, but don't do this. We didn't commit suicide, we committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
After everyone was, well, Jones shot his wife before unaliving himself in the same way. 918 people died that day in Jonestown, making it the largest deliberate loss of life in the United States at the time. On the bright side, there were about 85 to 90 individuals that actually survived, located either in Jonestown or at the airstrip. Most fled into the jungle earlier that fateful day or just barely survived the shootout on or around the plains. One woman, Catherine Thrash, hid under her bed, not wanting to partake in the Kool-Aid meeting. She eventually fell asleep or maybe just passed out, only to awake to everybody being kapooyad outside. I mean, can you imagine what it would have been like to wake up to complete silence and 900 plus bodies outside? Many of the visitors that survived the attack at the airstrip were either wounded or completely in shock following what just happened. They spent the night at a nearby cafe, or if they were more severely wounded, they stayed in small tents set up on the airstrip. Larry Layton, who had been stopped and detained by the group, was soon arrested by the Guyanese police. On the morning after everything had happened, Guyanese government planes were sent out to evacuate the wounded. In Jonestown, bodies were transported back to the United States by U.S. military. Jim Jones was found laying on the main stage of the pavilion with a pillow under his head. Some of Jones's children were there that day and did not survive. The process of evacuating all of the bodies took a little over a week, considering they had to fly back over 900 deceased temple members. Officials on site discovered hundreds of thousands of dollars stashed away, a large supply of passports, and caches of weapons. In the end, back in the US, there was only one man that faced punishment in the form of a trial. Larry Layton was tried and found guilty of aiding and abetting in the murder of Leo Ryan, as well as the attempted murder of US Embassy official Richard Dwyer, who was there with Ryan on the day everything went down. It sucks that basically no high-ranking members in the cult were punished for what they did, considering, well, I guess, they're all dead. The entire thing was covered pretty heavily by the media. Other than those living under a rock, nearly everyone in the United States knew of what had happened in Jonestown. Remaining members of the People's Temple, mostly consisting of individuals back in San Francisco or LA, decided to fully disband the organization after discovering what had happened in Guyana. Over 400 unclaimed bodies were buried at Evergreen Cemetery in California. Recently, in 2011, plaques were built in the cemetery with the names of all 900 plus deceased individuals inscribed on them, controversially including the man responsible, Jim Jones. Jonestown will forever be known as one of the most tragic events to ever happen in recent history, all caused by the delusion, manipulation, and controlling nature of just one man.